Okay, thank you. Oops. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon, even though it's a lovely day out. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Lantain. I'm a senior researcher in Asia Studies here at NUPI, and I'm very pleased to chair this session today. We have a very honored guest coming in from very far away, actually not really, London, but gives me great pleasure to chair this session on some very important topics which have been making the news over the past little while on the subject of climate change and the various responses to this from great powers, specifically in this case, China and the European Union, as well as other parts of the West. Just over the past few days, right before the summit in Hangzhou, the G20, a rather interesting announcement was made by the heads of government of the United States and China, saying that they are going to be jointly ratifying the Paris Agreement on climate change, which was developed late last year. So quite a bit has been happening in a very short time, but we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Olivia Gipner here today, who will be talking specifically about the Paris deal, the response from China, and the response from Europe. So hopefully this will be of great interest to all of you. Just a bit of background. Dr. Gipner is a Dahrendorf postdoctoral fellow in EU East Asian Affairs at LSE, as well as the LSE Ideas Project. She holds a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin, and I had the chance to get to know her. We were working on the same project related to Asian perceptions of Europe at the Free University 3 years ago, so very happy to invite her back. Her areas of specialty are environmental security, climate change, as well as Chinese policymaking, as well as quite a bit on Europe as well. And at the same time, she also is the author of editor of a report, which I very strongly recommend, Changing Waters Towards a New EU-Asia Strategy. That is available online if you're interested. So will everyone please join me in welcoming Dr. Gipner this afternoon? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for having me, and yeah, thanks to Ren and Mark for organizing this and yeah, for being interested in my topic as well. I will speak about, to some extent about the Paris deal, but mostly about China-EU relations today, and especially on the field of climate change. My starting point in a way was this picture, where we see on the left hand Connie Hedegaard, the former commissioner on climate change in the EU, and on the right Xie Zhenhua, who is the special envoy on climate change in the Chinese National Planning Commission. And I was fascinated by the way she's seemingly pleading to him, either, I don't know, talking about the high emissions that China still has. Is she commending him, saying, oh, you've done quite a good job, how do we get the others on board? And who are those other people in the back who are advising maybe Xie Zhenhua? What's happening in this relationship? So I wanted to go a bit deeper and understand how decision-making happens and how these different actors interact, and especially as we see so much change over the past 5 years. Oh, sorry. So my core message, I'd say, or my core question here was, under what conditions are EU-inspired climate policies adopted in China? I phrased it a bit weirdly, but what the EU is advocating is not always an EU invention, and yet it's a big promoter. And my focus is very much on the bureaucratic battles that take place within China, that frame the reaction to what the EU and what other actors do and try to promote. And the core kind of agency is the National Development and Reform Commission, a sort of super ministry in China, which has been gaining importance over the past few years. Before I go into my presentation, I would like to give, just a short note on my project and why I'm here. So it's called the Dahrendorf Project. Lord Dahrendorf was the president of the LSE, but also a British and German politician, and he kind of had this idea in his head that we should question the EU and Europe and ask the questions that nobody dares to ask. So this project at the moment is looking at the EU and the world, looking at 5 regions. You can see them here. The MENA region, North America, Russia and Ukraine and Turkey, and then me focusing on China together with a group based in Berlin. So we're really trying to capture all these different regions, and it's been an incredibly exciting past 2 years, I think, not just from a research perspective, but for everybody. Okay, so about my presentation today, I will start with kind of the puzzle and the research question, explain where I was coming from, then talk about the strategic change, which I think took place with COP21, and then go a bit more into detail on what I mean with bureaucratic politics, looking especially at the case of emissions trading and how that has been introduced in China. I will conclude with sort of a new research I'm looking at the moment, where I'm looking at how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is also getting more involved in climate policy, and again, which European actors could be involved in that. The main contradiction that I started my research with was this question of seemingly resistance at the international level, which you see on the right hand. This is a picture from the Copenhagen Summit. You can see the frustration on all sides, the feeling that this has failed from a Chinese perspective, from a European perspective. There was no agreement on global emissions caps and so on. And at the same time, pretty much there was an agreement to introduce emissions trading, and starting with what you see here, 7 pilot regions, so different provinces in China which trial out emissions trading at the moment. So I felt like there was a bit of a contradiction especially in Europe, it was always the international negotiations first, which then kind of gave the impetus to policy change, while here it seems to be quite the other way around. At the same time, these are all the policies that the EU is advocating. So that's where I could bring in, or where I could focus on this bilateral relationship. So back to my questions, under what conditions are EU-inspired climate policies? So I would say that's, for example, emissions caps, that's emissions trading, that is carbon capture and storage. When are these adopted in China? And before I continue with looking at my case, the big change was really then a few years later, in 2014, first the US-China agreement, the first one, where they said we will introduce targets, we will commit to emissions reductions in our ways. China especially saying we will peak by 2030 with our emissions. And then a year later, we obviously have the Paris COP21, where we see also a softening of the language. Sorry, I'm always bringing up Xie Jianhua, but it's good to know him because I think he's been absolutely instrumental for the Chinese climate policy. Where he was saying that on emissions trading, for example, the EU are our teachers, something you would never have heard a couple of years ago. And then 2016, what you were just mentioning, where China and the US joined Norway, which was one of the first to ratify, in ratifying the Paris Agreement, ahead of the European Union, which cannot do it yet because the Paris Agreement has to be adopted by or ratified by all member states individually, and for some it means a constitutional change. So it's, I think, in the span of 6 years we've seen, or even 7 years, we've seen really dramatic change in who holds climate leadership. So the kind of convergence that we've been seeing over the past few years, I tie it to the way people make sense of this question of climate change. Especially in China, there were a lot of changes over the last few years. And the big questions are, in a way, what do you define as climate change? For example, is it human-made? Is it anthropogenic? Who is responsible? And then the last question, should we act? So each country has to ask itself those questions. And in the past, the Chinese answer was quite early on, actually, it's human-made. I think everybody who's been to China realizes that. Just thinking of the air pollution and pollution in general. But then when it was about who is responsible, there was a clear answer saying not us, because the industrialization took place much earlier, so the developed countries have been benefiting for many decades while polluting, and now we are asked to stop our emissions. So there was a clear answer to that, no, not us. And that also goes to this question, should we do something about it? And I would say that one of the key elements in this, I don't know how to point, it's like it was also the US abstention of the negotiations, pretty much. The US never ratified the previous agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. So that was also a very strong argument to say, we are not acting for now. And I think that balance has shifted since the US is now on board and there is a Paris Agreement. There's more of a convergence of how China and the EU think about climate change. And in fact, it's even a little bit the opposite, that the EU is now much more hesitant in committing to climate policy upfront as it was doing in the past. I was looking at this question of change also in the terms of energy policy. So energy policy is always kind of a main vehicle to implement climate improvements. And I was looking at the kind of official documents of the EU and China, comparing them over the years. And here you're seeing the European Council conclusions over time. Every time they mention energy, and then looking at what context they refer and they talk about energy. So the first one is availability, so that's kind of energy security. Affordability is about how expensive is energy. Environmental stewardship is exactly this idea of energy policy to achieve climate goals, and then efficiency focused on improving your economy, energy efficiency, and so on. So what's quite interesting is that, for example, in 2006, and then overall also, the energy security frame is actually quite dominant, even before the one on climate. So comparing that to the Chinese 5-year plans, which they're not exactly the same, but the EU does not have planning documents like this. I was surprised to find that actually what we would expect, like that energy security is kind of the key driver for energy policy, was not as dominant in the rhetoric than questions of environment and efficiency, energy efficiency. So I think we already see here that sometimes the perception of how the two countries or the two actors behave in international relations is not actually matched by how they think about themselves and how they think about their own policy making. And I would say that overall there is more of a convergence in the terms and the frame of energy and climate policy. Now, I'd just like to talk quickly about what I understand under EU environmental foreign policy, so the EU trying to influence other actors. And in the relationship with China, this started in 2005. So there was a kind of, it's called the Rolling Plan on Climate Change, which was decided between the two countries. And the EU made it its official goal to promote climate in its diplomacy in 2011. So it's an official strategy now. The instruments in the bilateral relationship are quite limited. As you know, the EU is quite strong when it tries to influence its neighborhood, when it tries to influence possible EU members, EU candidates. But vis-à-vis China, obviously, that's quite limited. So it's really much focused on meetings at the multilateral level, but also bilaterally. Joint projects, programs on climate change. There were several very big loans, I will talk about them later again, given by the EIB to develop the Chinese climate program. And then capacity building, which is kind of the umbrella term for all kinds of technical and knowledge transfer that the EU does. So it's often representatives from the European Union. I think the same is true for Norway, which is also very active, going to China, training officials, but also the other way around, delegations visiting installations here, visiting governments here to see how policy is made. There's also pretty much one coercive attempt of influencing Chinese climate policy. This was when the ETS was extended to aviation, which led to a big, I don't know, upheaval or strong reaction across the world, not just in China. But I think that's the only time we can really see the EU trying to be quite forceful with its climate idea. Since I'm talking a lot about China later on, the motivation, so to say, to try and influence a country like China is, on the one hand, kind of a normative commitment. We are a climate actor. We want everybody to be on board. You have to have China on board if you want to do something about it. But obviously also there are material interests in terms of green technologies, industries which are quite well developed in this part of the world. So there's an interest to sell those products also. And the last point about polity building, so this idea that the EU needs to define itself as well. So it's quite nice to be saying we are the climate actor and we are the good ones here. So being quite active vis-à-vis China is also kind of an inward-looking exercise. Now looking at the other side of the spectrum, China. I'm just to give you a small idea. I've just selected some of the institutions which are involved in climate policy, and you can already see that it's quite a few, because the climate policy itself is maybe a thing of the last 10 years, or, if at all. So there's a lot of interest or also uncertainty about who's actually in charge and who should take care of finance that comes in, of developing policies, of overseeing projects. So again, quite important is the National Climate Leading Group. It's kind of a group that's above all the ministries and overseen directly by the Prime Minister. And I think the core institution is the National Development and Reform Commission here, which does the economic planning for the country. But then you have many other actors, ministries which could be involved, think tanks, Chinese think tanks, which have a bit of a different role there than here. They're often government think tanks, so they are directly involved in the decision-making process. And also a few non-state actors, especially universities, to a small extent, the media and the public. So the way I look at climate policy making in China is through these institutions, through how they interact with each other in the process. So for that, I'm using the theory of bureaucratic politics, which says that pretty much how you see an issue depends on where you sit, whether you sit in the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Science, for example. So each of these actors will have a different idea of what's in the national interest. They also will have a different idea of what is their top target to do. So for example, the Ministry of Finance will want to take or be in charge of everything that's related to taxation. And then finally, this idea of acquisition or defense of turfs. So policy areas that are new, for example, climate change, are interesting because it means you can get new resources, new budget, new staff, and so on. So these are kind of the main tenets of this approach. And this is also important, so the idea of how bureaucratic politics take place. So there are certain rules of the game. And in China particular, I'm using this concept of guanxi, so personal relationships based on a similar background, of a similar school, which are quite important. So who are these stakeholders? The slide looks maybe a bit boring, but it's actually pretty difficult to get because budget numbers have only been published for, I think, 2 years. So what we see is that the institutions that I think are the most important, and most of my research is based on interviews and document research. So first, the National Development Reform Commission, which, as you can see, actually has not a very big budget compared to the other ones, but as a planning authority has a lot of control over policies, over planning, over what kind of laws are actually, or policies are actually decided on. So it sees itself as in charge of climate change policy, and it has a direct access to the State Council, which is kind of the top leadership of the country. Then there are other actors, like the Ministry of Environment Protection, which in many countries would be in charge of climate change, or environment policy making, but actually in China is more of an implementing agency. The Ministry of Finance, which whenever there's a tax involved, carbon tax, but also emissions trading that I'll talk about later, has a high interest to get involved. Then we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, since climate change is also something negotiated at the international level. They're obviously part of the delegation and then trying to influence climate policy. And finally, the Ministry of Science and Technology, because a lot of climate policy, again, relates to scientific research. So all of these are actually interested in having a piece of the pie, so to say, of what policies are implemented in China. Yeah, this is another kind of diagram trying to explain how I'm thinking about this. So on the one hand, I'm seeing the EU member states, but also, for example, Norway, Australia, California, all these kind of climate leaders, trying to influence, through programs, through capacity building, through meetings, trying to influence Chinese climate policy. But actually, as in most countries, what's happening is actually inside. And since we don't have a kind of the same type of transparent policy process, a lot of the debates take place between the institutions, between the bureaucracy. So in order to analyze this, I was looking at three case studies. One was the 2-degree target. So this decision in the Copenhagen Agreement to decide that 2 degrees is what we want to limit, our global warming to. The story of this, I'm just going to summarize it quickly since I will not go into detail. The story of this is quite interesting because it is a bureaucratic story where initially climate change was seen as a weather issue. So it was under the China Meteorological Administration for many years. So as I mentioned, now the NDRC is the kind of key decision maker. And when the debate started on the 2-degree target, the NDRC was not really interested in it because they were like, what does this mean? It's not really relevant to us. Why would we care? So the kind of old meteorological administration said, okay, maybe this is our moment to influence policy again. So they used, they did their internal studies, which were supported by kind of key people, especially in the UK, someone like Nick Stern, who many of you might know, was involved in these meetings, and they did the kind of modeling to see which kind of temperature target would make sense from a Chinese perspective. And they could communicate that directly to the Prime Minister at the time, Wen Jiabao, and could put that on the agenda. So just before the Copenhagen Summit, the Chinese government said, okay, this 2 degrees target could actually be something that we're interested in. It was never mentioned before and really went a bit under the radar. At the time, the Copenhagen Summit was seen as a failure, right? But actually establishing this target and now going even below that was a core achievement. The other case that I looked at was carbon capture, utilization and storage. So in China, there's a lot of emphasis on this utilization aspect. This story was quite influenced by the European Union because when I started 2006 and 2007, the UK started a project on near zero emissions coal, and the Chinese government was not very convinced of it. The NDRC thought it's another way of the West, so to say, to limit Chinese growth. So they were like, no, we're not interested in this. But the Ministry of Science and Technology said, let's see how this goes. Let's try and bring this and commercialize this technology and work together with the Europeans on this. So a few years later, the Ministry of Science and Technology had shown first successes of this approach, and it became part of the national strategy. So today, it's actually China is one of the countries with most plans trying to use CCS. Interestingly, in around 2013, the portfolio of CCS went to the NDRC, because now they saw the benefit of this policy and of this technology, so they took over the control on this approach. So what I'm trying to highlight, obviously, is a certain perspective on policy making. Of course, there are many other reasons, but I think it's important to look a bit under the surface and understand which interests are behind. As I mentioned before, the way I was doing my research is mostly focused on interviews, but also on document analysis in China and in Europe. So I would like to talk more about the story of emissions trading. And initially, the question really was, how do we reduce emissions? What makes most sense for a country like China? And based on that, there were two main alternatives looked at. So one was the emissions trading scheme, and the other one was the carbon tax. I know that in Norway, there's actually a combination of the two, but the debate in China took place pretty much exclusively. So, sorry, there's a lot of text, so maybe I'll just explain. Just thinking about what makes sense from a Chinese perspective, there could be many arguments. But one of them, for example, is that China is a planned economy still. So the idea that you introduce a market-based instrument at first seems a bit surprising. Also, this question of a huge country which would have to introduce new institutions. This is the point here, because emissions trading, you need verifiers, you need very clear emission registries, you need a central authority, you need a trading platform. All these things seems rather complex. While if you had gone for a carbon tax, as I mentioned before, it would be handled under the Ministry of Finance, which has experience in collecting taxes. So there are a couple of reasons where you can compare the two policies. And my conclusion would actually be that from a Chinese perspective, a CO2 tax would have been quite beneficial to achieve the target of emissions reductions. But as you know, as we discussed before, the Chinese government went for emissions trading. And one of the, I think maybe I'll not show this, but one of the role models at the time available was the European emissions trading system. Again, another argument why you'd be a bit skeptical, right? If you look at the development of the prices for emissions emissions allowances, which went down dramatically. Here, the more up-to-date data, where we see another drop with the Brexit vote. I think the price is now around €3.60, so it's really not a big success. And yet ETS was adopted in China and is planned to be introduced in 2017. So we see a development over time where in the 11th five-year plan, kind of ambitious energy intensity targets were introduced, which created the basis for trying to reduce emissions, and then initial trading schemes were started. First voluntary, and then pilot schemes. So the plan at the moment is that next year, actually, the whole country will be covered by emissions trading, which would mean it would become the biggest market in the world. Behind that, though, there was, again, as I was mentioning, some kind of battle internally. The way I would maybe like to focus on this element here, the bureaucratic politics game. So once the decision came in 2006 to do something about emissions trading, to do something about emissions reduction, proposals were made by the different institutions. And NDRC, which I mentioned before, was in favor of emissions trading. the person I showed you before, Xie Jianhua, had studied emissions trading intensely before, was a big advocate of this approach, and so was his institution. But the Ministry of Finance at the same time put out proposals for introducing a carbon tax for pretty much the few reasons that I mentioned to you, that it might be easier to implement. There's an existing infrastructure to implement it, and so on. So this kind of turf battle took place obviously mostly behind closed doors, where the different ministries and people involved were lobbying. The State Council were trying to convince each other. To the public, what you can see is statements which are issued over the period of around 4 to 5 years, where the two are saying, we will introduce a carbon tax, we will introduce an emissions trading system, without a doubt. So to the public, it was quite unclear. It seemed like both were going to be implemented. But then, as I mentioned, and I think that's the sign here, where one bureaucratic actor wins over the other, when the State Council, so kind of the political leadership, announced that emissions trading would be introduced. And the explanation is that the NDRC simply is a more powerful institution which had direct access to convince of their policy. So when I think about it from the perspective of EU-China relations, I look at the EU as a kind of as trying to influence this process that's happening here. So on the one hand, the EU is sort of a passive model, because it was the biggest existing market. It had already tried out some of the approaches, had already realized what's not working, so there were negative lessons to learn from. But at the same time, it was also very active. So training officials, training the think tanks that I mentioned in the beginning, through different projects, through also supporting reports and supporting the kind of evidence that could be gathered on the topic. There was one instance which I already mentioned to you, which was the extension of the EU ETS to aviation of all airlines. So the idea was that I think it was in 2012 that all flights from beginning to end should be covered under the ETS, which from the Chinese perspective was an intrusion not only into climate policy making, but into sovereignty, actually, because they were seeing it as a regulation of the so to say the part that's between China and the border of the European Union. So this is, if you Google ETS today, that will still be the most common response you get, because people felt insulted by this kind of overstep of boundaries. And what's interesting, and that's why I put this picture here, is that the emissions trading system at that time was still considered a tax. So you can see that it's still kind of in between what are we actually doing. It's still in the creation phase. What was the effect of this scandal? It was not just China, which was very upset. Also, the United States said, "Okay, we're not doing this. This is impossible." So it's never been implemented. Yet, if you look a bit deeper, the European rule had a kind of a caveat saying that it will not be applied if a country has an equivalent measure on its own the emissions of its flights. So, in fact, when you look at the Chinese emissions trading legislation, it does cover aviation now. So one could say, okay, it was an overstep and it was an infringement of sovereignty, but actually might also have pushed this reaction and might have pushed the way the legislation went. So going back to my kind of arrow here, that's how I'm trying to make sense of it. So the EU does a lot of things, tries to be a leader or a role model itself, is active and invests money, invests efforts into influencing. But then the question is really who wins over the other, is a policy adopted or not. And I think in this case it was rather visible because there were two clear actors competing with each other. Yeah, so my conclusion from this case is that they compete with each other, and what's quite interesting is, as I showed you in the beginning, the budgets are not so big. So actually what they're competing about is more the control of policies, the access, and also the access to decision making at the leadership level. When I go a step further, so after the policy was officially adopted, we're now in a phase of what I'd call intensive learning. And the key lessons, now the cooperation between the two actors is much more focused on the practical issues. So there are several big capacity building projects which train provincial officials, which train central officials, and the kind of main lessons are, on the one hand, negative learning from the existing system. So on the one hand, how to allocate emissions allowances. As you know, in Europe, and I guess also here, the problem was that important industries were given too many allowances to emit, which meant that the price of emissions of carbon went down, and it's not attractive simply right now to reduce emissions. So the Chinese are trying to develop a bit more innovative ways to allocate and to also be flexible in taking back some of these allowances later. And one of the key lessons is the market stability reserve, which is actually entering into action earlier in China than it will be in the European Union. The second big learning is on measuring, reporting, and verification. So this is very important when you think about establishing an overall cap to emissions. You need to know how much emissions there are in the first place, and you need to be able to track those. And in China, data transparency is not, let's say, it's not the most developed area. So initially there was a bit of an open and self-reporting system, but especially over the past few years and with the pilots, there was a realization that a third party has to verify actual emissions by installations, by companies, in order to take part in the system. So the third party verifiers can still not be foreigners, so that's been made very clear by the authorities, but they have to be an independent agent. The last, there are several learnings, but the last one I would say is that similar to the European side, there's a very clear learning period in the development of the system. So where you can adjust, allocation methods, where you can adjust who and what is covered by the system. Just a note on what Norway is doing, especially on ETS during the pilot phase. So when I was back in Beijing in April, actually the work of the Norwegians was mentioned quite a lot. First on developing the MRV, again, is measuring, reporting, and verification. So Norway is supporting a development of guidelines, national guidelines, with the NDRC. The second point is something called the ETS Help Desk, China Carbon Market Platform and Training Materials. So this is very much targeted at training officials. So one of the issues is that when you have an ETS, you need to implement it in each province, in each municipality. So you have in a country with the size of China, you have a huge demand for people simply. So you need to kind of create a way of training people without them all being in one room, but rather making it a bit more decentralized. So Norway is very active at supporting the NDRC's work on this. Third point is the establishment of a national registry system. So national registry is what I mentioned before, this kind of stock take of what emissions are there. And then finally, and that's a very important element also, they're involved in a project on the implementation plans for all provinces. So these are plans done by the province on how they will actually scale the emissions trading system up. Initially, the NDRC did not want to introduce this, but as the pilots went on, it became clear that this has to be harmonized in order to achieve the national system. So although I was not talking about it much, Norway is a very, very important actor, especially on emissions trading in China. So before I conclude, I would like to talk quickly about the European Investment Bank, which I think is an emerging actor in this bilateral relationship between the EU and China. And just looking at some numbers again, this is the amount of money that's been given so far on climate policy over the years, so altogether 1.25 billion. It's not crazy, especially if you think of the scale of China, but it's been quite instrumental, especially the first loan on developing the climate infrastructure in the beginning. Right now, the focus is very much on forestry, kind of unusual areas where it's difficult to get money from commercial banks. And again, I will talk a little bit about the boring structures, but what I find fascinating again is that here in this kind of different actor, the European Investment Bank, when it gives loans in China, especially on climate projects, again, it interacts with the NDRC. So I think you're realizing it's really a gatekeeper and the core institution. The project development, so let's say forest development in Heilongjiang in a Chinese province, has to be in touch with its municipality, then with the province, and then the NDRC decides from like all the proposals that come from the different provinces, which one they would allow the European Investment Bank to give a loan to. So you can see there's quite a bit of bureaucracy involved, but then the projects which are supported by the EIB are often very, very targeted. There's a parallel structure during the implementation phase, so when the finance is actually given out, making it again quite difficult to use EIB lending. So the role of the European Investment Bank in this bilateral relationship is to support climate projects or to support environmental projects. And the role they see for themselves is on the one hand to have a demonstration effect, so to support certain initiatives which could not be implemented otherwise. You have to imagine normal bank loans around 2 to 3 years in a commercial bank, but the European Investment Bank sometimes gives 25 years, 7 years to really make projects which are normally impossible bankable. So the European Investment Bank is only investing in projects with a high value added in terms of environment. There was more interaction before, but it's been limited a little bit in the past few years due to the solar power dispute. So, for example, investment in renewable energy is unlikely at the moment. So it's really focused on these very specific projects. And again, thinking about this question of what role does such an institution, what role do European actors play, I identify 4. So on the one hand, knowledge transfer. The EIB has been in existence for about 50 years. So it has a lot of experience with projects in Europe. There are, for example, very forested areas like Finland, I guess, where it has a lot of experience in implementing these projects. So that's one. Second one, a transfer and cooperation in financial terms. So how do you structure such loans? How do you monitor them? And one important element is that the EIB requires public procurement, like international public procurement. So say a project developer needs equipment. They need to procure it globally, which is an unusual demand. But then in a way, you're building the capacity of that project developer to do that in the future as well. The demonstration effect, which I spoke about, and then the last point, which is becoming more important now that there's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a certain element of institutional persuasion, I call it. So the EIB has opened an office in Beijing last year, and amongst others with the goal of helping in the setup of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a quite similar institution actually, similar to the World Bank, similar to the Asian Development Bank. So as they're setting up, they recruited, or they had people actually sitting in their offices from these other banks, and the EIB was also providing that. So there's an interest to influence how this new bank operates, and for example, the fact that the EIB has already said that environmental concerns are its second most important criteria, show that there are big overlaps between the two. So through that, they're trying to influence the setting up of this new institution. The other element that where the EIB tries to convince is that it tries to it has lobbied the NDRC to develop a clear department when it deals with those multilateral development banks, because so far that's not the case. So here this different institution tries to influence on the one hand through the projects it finances, but also in looking at this new institution that China is setting up. So yes, let me conclude here. So what are the consequences of all this for EU-China relations? Really, the EU can only influence or be an actor when it has something unique to offer. And there are a few areas only where this is the case. And especially in the last few years, as China is becoming much more of a climate leader, this has become more of a two-way process now. So the European ETS is learning from the pilots, is learning from the flexibility mechanisms that China is introducing. The instruments that are at hand are quite broad, so dialogues, technology transfer. But I think what's quite important is to invest in understanding how the Chinese process works, and that means still increasing the capacity that the European decision makers have on how China works and how decision making works. And the last point, which I did not mention much today, but is this investment in long-term relationships, this idea of guanxi. This is, for example, important when you think of diplomats who are often seconded for only 3 years. In a system, when they're based in Beijing, it's quite difficult to establish the necessary network and to establish the necessary trust also, which is understandable in a context which is much more relationship-driven rather than institution-driven. So with this, I would conclude and yeah, pretty much say that I think China has become a climate change leader over the past few years, and that I think that bureaucratic politics is a useful lens to look at policy making in maybe especially non-democratic countries where you don't see the political process happening quite so open. All right, thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Whoops, very high octane microphone here. Okay, thank you. Well, let me just comment very briefly. So much of the news coverage about climate change foreign policy has focused primarily on the major two actors, the United States and China, including some of the recent announcements. So it is excellent that you're doing this work on another major bilateral relationship in the area of climate change legislation. That would be the EU and China. So very, very good addition to the debate. And at the same time, the discussion about China's identity as a climate change leader, certainly quite a bit has changed just over the past decade. So it's been very interesting talking about that aspect as well. But without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to questions. If anyone would like to ask something, raise your hands. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that China has become a climate change leader. I was wondering which aspects of the technological side does the EU still have an edge on China, and what can it still provide that is unique to China?
That's a very good question. I think that especially when you look at solar, wind, even carbon capture and storage, China is actually ahead of Europe. But I think one of the areas that's quite interesting from a Chinese perspective is this switch from coal to natural gas, where there's a lot of interest in experiences from Europe, because it sees, I think at the moment it's still 70% of the Chinese energy which is provided by coal, and they're quite, they're quite labor intensive. So to reduce that coal use is extremely difficult from a social perspective, because it means laying off people who might not easily be retrained. So at the moment, the idea is to shift very much into natural gas, which is already cleaner than coal, and by that, reduce the burden a little bit of switching complete industries. So I think that's, for example, an area where the EU has experiences to offer. But I'd agree with you that it's it's really leveling out the playing field. Yes.
Thank you. The gentleman in the front.
Could I just move a little bit on what you refer to now, the technological mix. Point one, solar energy, both in terms of the production of that and the export of the technology. You refer to some disagreement between the European Union and China on that. And so if you could take that a little bit further. Point two, the data that's coming out very recently saying coal production is on its way down. Mm-hmm. And that sort of, to me, is an exemplification of the end of a discussion that was really not a discussion. Namely that certain environmentalists in the West said China must close down the coal-fired plants. And that obviously was not going to happen. But what happened was a reduction in new investment. So in that sense, there is a shift. Then I would like you to say what you can say on your very last sentence, I think. Namely the lack of transparency of political decision-making. In other words, when you had your institutional framework up on some of the PowerPoints, I didn't see the Chinese Communist Party. And obviously it does exist, and it has quite a crucial influence on some major policy decisions. Just on the conceptual, the National Development and Reform Commission, is that just a new name for the State Planning Commission? Yes, it is, right. Now, obviously that is one very important modality by which the Communist Party exerts its leadership. And perhaps I would rephrase some of your discussion saying that the NDRC is gaining access to the State Council, rather that the NDRC has some sort of politically induced veto power over certain decisions on behalf of the party, which again controls the State Council. So again, the political institutional framework, if you could say something more on that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are very, very relevant questions. Maybe I'll start with the last one on the party. Maybe that's a limitation of my research, because as you know, I've done most of my research with interviews, and it's very difficult to talk about the Chinese Communist Party in that way. So I use the bureaucratic framework to make sense of what I'm observing. But of course, you're right that the party has a parallel structure to the bureaucracy that we see. On your point that the NDRC is maybe the vehicle of the party, I'm not so sure, because I think there's definitely a sort of organizational or institutional growth which where the NDRC has become stronger and stronger over the past few years. And in fact, when Xi Jinping came to power, that was one of his first plans, was to reduce the powers of the NDRC. And one of the ways of doing that was actually to create those leading groups, which are kind of above all the ministries. So I don't think he has succeeded, because there's not much reduction, but there is a perception that the NDRC as a bureaucratic institution is actually a bit too powerful, even internally. To relate that to internal Chinese party politics, I think would be difficult for me to give a convincing answer. On the solar production, so did you want me to talk more about the solar disputes, or?
It would be useful if you just highlight why it was a dispute and if it is being resolved.
Okay, so there was a dispute about solar photovoltaic panels which were sold in the European Union and allegedly below the market price, or below the cost of them. So the idea is that it's a dumping on the European market to crowd out local or European solar companies. So the anti-dumping tariffs were introduced. Quite interestingly, the European Commission asked for much higher tariffs, but then member states like Germany actually opposed. So the resulting tariff is a bit lower. This has consequences, obviously, that if a European institution says we want to support Chinese solar development, even if it's technically possible, it's politically a no-go. If you have anti-dumping measures in place, on the one hand, you cannot support solar development on the other. Where I think it's also quite interesting is when we look at the recent surge in foreign direct investment by China in Europe. And this has also gone into solar companies. So one could argue that because it's more difficult to sell the panels simply by trading them, some of these companies are now investing in European companies to still have a vehicle to either sell or to strengthen those relationships. So one could argue that it increased the investment in European solar companies, which is maybe a bit paradoxical. The last point you mentioned on the coal production, that it's on its way down. That's correct. It has been argued that coal has already peaked in China. The problem is with this that, as I mentioned before, there's a big social element to coal production. So we're actually there's a big overcapacity at the moment where coal plants are being operated, but maybe at limited speed, but to keep people in employment. So it's not the same as saying, okay, we're actually reducing our production. So, and that coupled with this shift and this desired shift to natural gas, I agree that coal is reducing, but still, as I mentioned, it's 70% of the energy mix, so it's still a massive proportion. And to manage, especially this social transformation, I think is maybe the key challenge. I think it's the same if you look at the United Kingdom. Brexit, in a way, you can link it to the way it was deindustrialized in some parts, right? In the divisions we see. So I think that when you have this classic mining and coal areas, there's always a very strong trade-off to reducing that. So China is very well aware of that. So the government is very slow and step-by-step in acting on this.
Okay, thank you. I would also add to that, in addition to natural gas, another major policy when it comes to energy in China has been diversification. Natural gas, very important, but there's also a lot of discussion about oil, about hydropower, obviously. You mentioned solar and even hydrogen. So some of these are still very much in the beginning stages. There's a question of, okay, what can we use now versus what would be viable 20 years from now? So the natural gas is obviously extremely important, but there's also a great deal of push towards diversification. So it'll be interesting to see how that factors into the mix when it comes to issues like these. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. And as far as I know, if the European climate change policy introduced to China, and I think for the CCP or the top leaders will first evaluate, ask the bureaucratic department to evaluate it first. But I think for bureaucratic politics should be more inclined to happen in the implementation level, rather than the policy decision level, because that will really it's because the climate change from EU, it will be really about the national interest. So I think for this key important policy should be up to the political leaders to decide whether we will take it or not. That is my one questions, whether it apply to the use this bureaucratic political theory to analyze this EU climate change. To this. Second one is, I'm really surprised that you did 80 interviews in China, and I'm really interested about which kind of people, which kind of interviewees do you have interviewed, and which kind of questions? Is it easy to accessible or not? And how do you think they are telling the truth, or just give you such kind of formulae to just say, oh yes, it's fine, we are doing very well, and you really dig out deeply to see the truth of the fact. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment and small criticism, I understand. Yes, I agree with you that during the implementation phase, bureaucracy will be even more important because, as I mentioned, all of these programs have to be scaled up to a national scale, and then you immediately decentralize and you involve a lot of people. So the divisions become quite clear. The reason why I argue this also for the adoption of the policy ideas is that this is what came out of my interview. So I agree with you that maybe the State Council for me is still a black box. Who calls the last shot? I will not be able to tell. But in terms of influencing this decision and in terms of lobbying the top leadership, I think it, especially on emissions trading, people like Xie Zhenhua, I'm sure, were absolutely crucial because he was a very early supporter of the system. He was sorry, this is German. He was called back to represent China for COP21 from his retirement. He's so crucial, to the process. So I'm convinced that these are very, very important elements. But you're right that it could well be that there's another layer that I would not have had access to. On the interviews, and again, this is where I got the information from. I never dreamt of doing research on Chinese decision making before starting this because I thought it would be so difficult to simply get the information. I spoke to pretty much all, I call it the climate network, so to say, all the people involved. So to some extent, the government, the ministries I showed you, NDRC, Ministry of Finance, especially at the international negotiations, I would meet them for interviews because it's everybody's in the same room, so it's easy to arrange these things. But then also talk to academics, talk to think tanks, particularly in Beijing, who are, as I mentioned, often involved in this kind of drafting process. They are asked to provide reports. They're asked to do the analysis much more, I think, than it's the case in our countries. So I asked them questions from. Actually, I did not focus on the EU per se. So I asked more about how do you see the development of climate change policy? Who do you see as the main actors? Who do you see as the main? What do you see as the main factors influencing? And then, depending on the person's expertise, obviously, in more detail about emissions trading or carbon capture and storage. I tried to be as little suggestive as possible. Obviously, if you ask, what do you think about the EU, then you're driving the discussion a little bit. But still, and this is why I showed the first quote on Xie Jinhua saying the EU is our teachers. I mean, initially when I was doing my interviews, such a sentence would have been crazy. It's like, we don't need the EU, we are making our own policy, it's a completely different situation. That on the one hand, but then on the other hand, this very big openness to learning from other experiences. So how do I verify that they're saying the truth? This applies everywhere, in fact. I think that in all institutions, people have main lines, have main messages that they're supposed to give. So for me, every interview is often the same, but then there is one element which is new, which gives me a new hint. And then, especially, so I did my PhD on some of this. I would have to anyway prove this with documents, with the actual facts. So the interviews are more of they point you to kind of what to look for and give you a narrative of how things develop over time. And I don't know if you're doing your own research, but what I always find most fascinating if you ask people how they make sense of how things developed. Because often we always talk about the now and the situation now, but actually when you realize how people think about how, for example, climate change policy evolved, you learn a lot. Like, for example, how pollution became much more important, even though pollution was already terrible 10 years ago. But it, it raised in awareness just over the past few years. So these kind of things, it's really, really fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Just a short follow-up question. Through your interviews, do you have any kind of impression that the people you talk to are in any way influenced by some sort of pressure from below? Do they in any way sort of reflect on what people discuss, what people are concerned about, or is this an entirely sort of play at the top level, political level?
It depends. So, for example, there's this case of air pollution measuring in Beijing, the PM 2.5, so small particles, which I think it was 2012. The United States Embassy had a measurement on its embassy, and I think almost everybody was connected to that. And then the Chinese government said, "Okay, no, this is an interference in our sovereignty. Stop that." And the reaction was very, very strong, and now the government is publishing its own data, obviously with different, scales and what's considered what. But when there are such issues, and I think here social media becomes very important, where it really rises to the public perception, and it's really important. I do think that the people, that the elite, so to say, listen. And also, I think it was the environmental law, which was passed last year, had a public consultation phase. So there are, I wouldn't say that in the interviews it's a big topic, like how people think about it, besides that everybody wants less pollution. But I think there are moves in that direction. And I think especially pollution, climate change is not the same, but that's what it's perceived as. Is quite a big topic at the moment. So even if you think about social stability and this kind of general idea of support for the party, I think it's taken just very, very seriously as an issue. Whether it's in the individual cases, like on emissions trading, I don't think people mention to me the public wants an ETS or a tax. I mean, that companies, for example, have opinions on this, yes, but not the public.
And just to add, there's also increasing discussion in China about the so-called green GDP. In other words, how much of China's growth is being taken away by various aspects of pollution, be it air, water, and so forth. What are the economic costs? So that slowly started to seep into the dialogue, but as you say, it's been taken much more seriously on several levels, from the public to the party to the upper echelons of the government. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Mette Halskov Hansen. I'm directing an interdisciplinary project about air pollution in China, of which these two gentlemen are also
But
part.
I hope you can disagree with everything.
No,
I said.
I didn't disagree with anything actually. But I have a question, and that is, it's very interesting that the way you present how engaged your interviewees are in the whole issue of climate change, and China is now a climate change leader and all these things. In our project, we have media scholars who go through all the media debates about pollution, and I agree entirely with you that there's a very heightened acknowledgement of the problem of pollution, not only from experience, but also from learning from the media. But it seems to us that the issue of climate change is more or less non-existent in the Chinese media. It's something that people on the top are very much concerned about. But I really wonder if it ever reaches, or not ever, but at the moment it doesn't seem to reach the more general population. So I wonder, in your interviews, are there any kind of recognition that this knowledge about climate change has to reach out to the broader population? We found even among intellectuals in our project that many people tend to believe that climate change is indeed man-made, but fortunately this is something that will not affect China so much, which is of course not the case. So I wonder if you have any comments on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fascinating because China is one of the very vulnerable countries, actually, if you think of desertification in the north, which is already taking place. I think there was little debate, or maybe because I didn't ask those questions about how to, spread information or spread knowledge to the public. What I did notice, though, is that when I was looking at NGOs, which obviously have a bit of a different status in China because it's often difficult to register as an NGO, so you don't really know who is an NGO. But if they relate to environmental concerns, then it's always very localized, focusing, for example, on a river or one installation which is pollutant, and then there is resistance and there are groups organized around it. But I was looking for climate change NGOs which go to COP21 and lobby. There are some, but it's, as you say, they're quite few, and I think that's maybe a bit of a reflection that the topic as a global topic is perceived differently or less urgent than the pollution you see locally.
Or maybe it's actually more sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that it's actually more politically sensitive to discuss climate change than to discuss pollution. I just wonder.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are reasons why it could maybe be so.
Yeah. I don't have an answer to that. I know that it's difficult to be an NGO and to lobby the government. So when it's such a broad policy topic, it could be. Yeah. But I think this is interesting because when we think about EU-China relations, the fact that climate policy is so dominant is that it's considered one of the less sensitive topics that you can cooperate on, where there are clear win-wins and benefits. So thank you. I think about it.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I may exercise chair discretion, ask you something as well. I'm thinking, with China's economy slowing down, and all this discussion about a soft landing and a rebalancing of the Chinese economy towards more domestic level development, do you see any of that having an effect on some of these pledges that you've been discussing, positive or negative, or perhaps too soon to tell?
I don't know if it's immediately related to the slowdown, but one of because the last time I went to China, I tried to reach out to companies because I think they're important and they're affected by all these policies. And I was looking especially at renewable companies, and they are facing some issues because there were targets set for them. For example, solar, massive enlargement of solar production domestically, and also trying to sell it more domestically, because in the past it was mostly for the export market. However, there are subsidies in place, but they're not being dispersed. So one of the difficulties they're facing is that they're not given permission to expand. So on the one hand, you have the government setting a target, saying we want solar to be much bigger, but on the other hand, they're limiting the actual expansion, and for financial reasons, because these would be massive amounts that are spent on subsidies. So at the moment, actually, these industries have an overcapacity, which is not very healthy. And in that way, I could see a connection that the reluctance to actually dispense could be a reaction to limited budget and to trying to focus on other more important areas. Yeah, and the other thing that I mentioned before is about the overcapacity in the coal sector that is kept alive quite strongly, which is expensive, but also you try to prevent mass unemployment in some regions. Yeah.
Points. Are there other questions? Yes, sir.
Isn't the cost of production going down globally and in China quite rapidly? So in other words, the subsidy argument would not be so compelling in a few years' time. So it might be possible to formulate a hypothesis being more optimistic in terms of expansion of production capacity, both for sale in China and for sales overseas, which could also influence the European Union debate. If cost of production are going down so rapidly for solar energy in China, maybe the argument of dumping would also disappear if the subsidies are substantially reduced to the Chinese producers.
That's a very good point. I agree that's a development that could happen, and at the moment there is also a reform of the electricity market, because at the moment electricity prices are still below a market price in China. So that's why reducing solar doesn't yet mean that it's actually attractive. But for example, that has happened for solar thermal energy, that it's already more attractive. If it will happen for solar PV, that could happen in the future. Yeah, so I agree that could be a more optimistic scenario. Just at the moment, I think solar companies in China are frustrated, and they are interested to also invest abroad and to see what to do with the expansion potential they have.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, hi.
Thank you for the presentation. And I have two things to say. Like, one is just briefly comment on Menda's question about having these climate change issues or environment pollution covered to the Chinese huge population. Because I'm Chinese, so I'm studied about the environment and climate change. So I was quite to follow up the media in China and the trend. So I see that gradually the media has started to covering more about the climate change issues and also this green economy, circular economy to the population, like some kind of dialogues in China, both in national level and some provincial level. Some shows and programs also target a little bit environment protection to address the issues. And also there's in some NGOs, international organizations in China, they have been following up researchers on the climate change, and actually they put it in WeChat, which the WeChat has kind of function of the giving the news to the public. So if you follow up this channel in WeChat, and these organizations will publish the climate change issues. So that's how, I think, one way to target it to the population. And
It increasing?
Yeah, I think it's increasing, and because it's a lot, I think it's gradually increasing the NGOs which are targeting on research on climate change in the public media. Yeah, and my question is, recently, like the China initiated this one road, one belt initiative, and China, also the AIIB has also said like they were trying to be like lean, clean, and green the institution for the project implementation. And so my question is like, but in the media, like this has been criticized by many environment activities, and say that it will have risk for the climate change. And how do you reflect on the issue, especially I think it's also about EU and China's cooperation in this one road, one belt initiative. So do you have some research or opinions on how they can cooperate for like integrating climate change policy, for example, into this initiative, into their project implementation? Yeah, thank you.
That's a tough one on One Belt, One Road, because I think it's still developing as a concept. So we know of a few of the projects which are under planning, like the railway lines to Europe, for example. So I think it's a bit too early to judge for me. But the intention clearly is to make environmental concerns, put them high on the agenda for projects that are being approved. The EU and the EIB signed a memorandum of understanding with the EIB just in May this year. So the investment that they want to do is in India on I think on a hydropower plant. So I don't know if that is a reflection, but the EIB has a target of 35% of its projects to be climate related. So especially when it invests, because most of the investment is actually in Europe, but then when it's overseas, even more than 35%. So in a way, that's the only thing I could think of, that when they do something together as a co-financed project, that then the EIB could, or they could focus, they will probably focus on climate-related projects. But how they can influence the running of the EIB, I think it's quite difficult, especially when you think about the focus on infrastructure investment. Obviously, a lot of it will be railways, will be not necessarily climate or environmental related. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but I feel like I can't predict much. But maybe you have an opinion because you've been working on this.
No, I agree. We're still dealing with the kind of opening stages of both Belt and Road and some of the major financial organizations like the EIB. I think the only thing I could add would be the two other major financial institutions which are China-backed, the New Development Bank, otherwise known as the Bank of BRICS, and the Silk Road Fund, which is directly related to Belt and Road. I think all three of these organizations are going to be under a great deal of scrutiny for many reasons, but I think one of them will be to prove their green credentials. So this could be another area where not only a lot of green topics will be brought up, but a lot of potential for consultation, given the fact that the European Union as a whole, as well as several European economies, are involved within each of these processes. So we may have to wait and see on this one. Thanks. Okay, any other concluding questions? Okay, seeing none. Just a few points. First of all, if you haven't noticed up here, this is a copy of the report which Olivia has edited, Changing Waters Towards a New EU-Asia Strategy. It is online, very highly recommended if you're interested in various areas of the relationship between these two entities. Second point is this presentation today has been part of an ongoing series being held by NUPI this year, the Europe-Asia Speaker Series. We are going to be continuing the speaker series well into the autumn, and just a quick point, the next presentation will be by myself, sorry for the shameless self-promotion, Monday afternoon on East Asia Maritime Security, so I very much hope you can come. And I will conclude by thanking Dr. Gipner very much for a really fascinating presentation on some very, very timely topics, and will everyone please join me in thanking her.